Okay, so the title of my paper is Love is Love, Obergefell versus Hodges, Love and the 14th Amendment. And the gist of my argument is that Obergefell, the case involving protection of same-sex marriage, seminal case written by Justice Kennedy, is really fundamentally about love in various manifestations. And I'm making the argument as a descriptive matter, and that if you read that opinion, it just is infused with the concept and ethos of love. And then I'm going to try to argue that there's a substantive element to love. And part of, I think, what I'm doing is it's a defense of the decision by Kennedy, because it's been critiqued by a lot of people for being lacking any substance, that it's just has all this flowery, this kind of like romantic essentially language about a marriage, how great it is, how transcendent it is, and there's no substance. So I'm trying to argue that there is substance in it, and the substance is love, the principle of love, the ethos of love, and then we can and should think of love as a constitutional principle. Okay, so let me start the slide. So here is, I'm going to first talk about some language from Obergefell, where it's really about marriage. And the word love actually comes up, I think, 4 or 5 times in the opinion, which I'd be curious to know how many other Supreme Court opinions talk about love, and at least once and multiple times. But in a lot of the opinion, there's language about marriage where essentially I'm arguing he's talking about love, in the marriage and love, or marriage or love, but marriage and its connection to love. So here's one of his statements about marriage. Rising from the most basic human needs, marriage is essential to our most profound hopes and aspirations. And what I did was just insert the word love, or substituted love for the word marriage, and the sentence works in exactly the same way. Rising from the most basic human needs, love is essential to our most profound hopes and marriage. Or you can say marriage and love are essential to our most profound hopes and marriage. And same thing with this sentence: same-sex couples too may aspire to the transcendent purposes of marriage and seek love and fulfillment in its highest meaning. So I'm inserting the word love, and like I said, it reads the same way. The meaning of the sentence is the same. In fact, it's actually arguably fuller, more meaningful by inserting the word love. And I'm arguing that in many sentences like this, love is implicit in those sentences. Okay. And so let me pull down the PowerPoint slide. Okay, so that's Obergefell, preview of Obergefell, and now I'm going to talk more about the decision in a little bit. But so first I want to talk about love and what is love, how theorists think about love, and then jump into Obergefell and try to argue that there are it's about love in at least 3 different ways. And then I want to talk about some of the broader implications of my analysis and argument. So love, it's hard to define the concept of love, but Erich Fromm, a psychologist, wrote a book called The Art of Love, argues that love shares some core elements. There are multiple kinds of love, but they all share these core elements. Love means having a sense of responsibility, care, respect, and empathy for another. And the way I think about it, love, in various kinds of love, involve Martin Buber's notion of the I-thou relationship in comparison to the I-it relationship. In an I-thou relationship, you treat the other person in the relationship as a fully autonomous human being with a will of their own. Whereas in I-it relationship, you treat the other person basically as an object. You objectify the other person. And argue in the terms of the highest forms of love, it embodies an I-thou kind of relationship. So I think those are the core elements of love in its kind of highest ideals, highest aspirations. And then let me talk about the different kinds of love, and the 3 kinds that are relevant to my argument. Different theorists about love have different definitions and terms, but here are the ones that are relevant to my argument. First, there's intimate or romantic love, and that's the kind of love implicated. It's about marriage, okay? And it's a love we associate with romantic relationships, sexual desire, etc. And that kind of love is also, and Kennedy talks about this, it can have transcendent spiritual aspects to it. And it talks, that notion talks about intimate love, talks about how two people come together and they create something greater than the sum of its parts. And now let me pull back this PowerPoint slide, and I'm going to quote a poet, my favorite poet. Let's see, hopefully let's get to it. Okay, here we go. Rilke wrote a poem called Love Song, and where he talks about romantic love between two people. And here's the relevant part, which talks about the greater thing created by through a loving relationship between two persons. So yet everything that touches us, me and you, two people in a loving relationship, takes us together like a violin's bow, which draws one voice out of two separate strings. Upon which instrument are we to span, and what musician holds us in his hand, oh sweetest song? The key part, I think, is the music, right, created by the bow connecting both strings, in which you create something greater, the music, but also within this conception, you have the two separate strings still maintaining their autonomy. And that's, for me, that captures the notion of the I-thou relationship. Okay, let me take that down. Okay, so that's romantic love, and that's at the heart of Kennedy's argument about marriage and the importance of marriage. Then there is familial love. The Greeks call it storge, and it's the love of a parent for his or her child, or members of a family, the love that members of a family have for each other. And then, which also Kennedy brings up in arguing that the right to marriage is fundamental, in that it also involves family love between family members, especially children. And then the third kind of love, which I think is the most important, is unconditional love. And at its core, unconditional love is selfless and other regarding. The theorists talk about unconditional love being about not what one receives, but about one gives. Martin Luther King Jr. says, unconditional love seeks nothing in return. So it's all about giving to a person things like empathy, respect, honor, etc. So it's other regarding care, unclaiming love, universal, unclaiming love for another. And there are three variations on unconditional love. One is having unconditional love for a specific person, having unconditional love for yourself, and then having unconditional love for the greater humanity in general. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the third aspect, because that's, I think, relevant to the Constitution, 14th Amendment, equal protection, universal unconditional love. It's part of the belief that, and it's about universal benevolence to all people, all humanity. And it involves an affirmation of humanity, the belief that we're one large human community. Eric Fromm, which he calls universal unconditional love, brotherly love. He states that universal unconditional love is the experience of union with all persons of human solidarity, of human at one-ment. It's based on the experience that we are all one. My favorite definition of unconditional love is the Buddhist understanding of unconditional love, and it's called metta. And in English, it's translated into loving kindness, but it's more than just loving kindness, it's multidimensional. And so it's defined, metta has been defined as a universal, unselfish, all-embracing love, encompassing loving kindness, friendliness, goodwill, benevolence, fellowship, amity, concord, inoffensiveness, and nonviolence. So obviously multidimensional, multiple elements. And that's one of the, I think, useful things about understanding the 14th Amendment through the conception of unconditional love. Its multidimensionality helps explain all different parts of the 14th Amendment. Okay, all right, and I'll get to that later. And the love, unconditional love for all of humanity, it's the love of aspiration. and it has potential for social transformation. The Buddhist talks about metta practice with boundlessness can overcome all social, religious, racial, political, and economic barriers and bring the world concord, peace, and mutual understanding, promoting human well-being. So you can write that that sentence has implications for 14th Amendment. And ultimately, the way I think of universal unconditional love is that it's a love of inclusion, not exclusion. Okay, love between romantic love is exclusive love, but unconditional universal love is very inclusive, by definition inclusive. Okay, so that's the kind of general understanding of love. Let's talk. I want to talk now. Turn to Obergefell and talk about how some of those concepts were expressed in the Obergefell decision. And I'm going to talk about Obergefell and love in 3 different ways. First, if you read the opinion as a whole, it reads as an expression of unconditional love for LGBT and same-sex couples in terms of tone, language, attitude, empathy. It's highly empathetic. It just exudes empathy, in my opinion, in terms of the language that Kennedy uses. And this is how he describes the petitioner, James Obergefell, and his relationship. He says in the sentence, petitioner James Obergefell, a plaintiff in the Ohio case, met John Arthur over 2 decades ago. They fell in love and started a life together and then got married. So that kind of empathy, kind of respect, honoring of same-sex LGBT and same-sex couples runs throughout the opinion. And I want to suggest he is expressing a kind of unconditional love for LGBT in the opinion. It's that notion of unconditional love, positive regard for others, for LGBT, is just absolutely infused in that throughout that opinion. So on a kind of rhetorical narrative level, I think the decision can be read as an expression of unconditional love, not in a doctrinal way, but in terms of kind of its just broader meaning and how it's really empathizing and showing compassion for LGBT. And just one last sentence, he says, in seeking the right to same-sex marriage, LGBT are asking for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. And I would just add, right, the word, I think you could have also written, they ask for equal dignity and unconditional love in the eyes of the law. And as I'll argue later, I think you can think of the 14th Amendment as about the law is about unconditional love. Okay, so that's one way. And now I want to turn to substance. This is where I think love, understanding how love is implicated in his substantive analysis, can be a way of arguing, yes, there's actual substance to his opinion. It's not just flowery, I can't pronounce the name. It's not just a sweeping romantic language about love and marriage. So I want to first talk about his argument about the right to marry being fundamental under substantive due process, and the right to same-sex marriage as also being protected under substantive due process and equal protection. And what I want to argue is that the right to marry is really a more specific articulation of the broader fundamental right to love, which itself is in a specific articulation of the broader fundamental right of personal autonomy, self-definition, and personhood that Kennedy articulated first in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and then articulated it again in Obergefell. So that's the broad, it used to be called the general right of privacy, but now it's after Planned Parenthood versus Casey, it's called the right of personal autonomy, and it's about protecting the right of self-definition, okay? And basically he argues that the right to marry is fundamental to one's ability to self-define oneself, how one identifies oneself, to one's autonomy and dignity. And in arguing that marriage is central to autonomy and self-definition, I'm arguing he's saying loving someone, being in a loving relationship, is also about a self-definition and personal autonomy. And again, let me read a couple sentences where he talks about marriage in relation to autonomy, and I'm going to include the word love and show that the sentence works within the inclusion of that word and actually arguably makes more sense. So he argues about, he states, a first premise of the court's relevant fundamental rights precedents is that the right to personal choice regarding marriage and love is inherent in the concept of personal autonomy. Next sentence, choices about marriage, and then I insert the word love. Choices about marriage and love shape an individual's destiny. It fulfills the yearnings for love, security, safe haven, and connection that expresses their common humanity. Civil marriage as an esteemed institution, and the decision whether and whom to marry and love is among life's momentous acts of self-definition. And that's why he thinks, he argues the right to marry is fundamental, because it's one way of defining oneself, how the relation to one's identity. And then again, just one last sentence, the right to marry thus dignifies couple who wish to define themselves by their commitment to each other. And I want to add the word love. It's right to marry is about dignifies couples who wish to define themselves through their loving commitment to each other. And so that's how I argue that when he's talking about the right to marry, it fully implicates the right to love. It makes complete sense, and it gives substance to the right to marry, and explains, I think, in a better way, in a stronger way, the connection between the right to love and self-definition and personal autonomy. So marriage then is just one aspect of the right to love, because you can love someone, right, be in a loving relationship without being married. And I don't see why one is protected but not the other. So marriage deserves protection as an institution, embodying the right to love, but also just love between two people who are unmarried also articulates and implicates that right to love, which like I'm arguing, it implicates the broader right of personal autonomy and the right to self-definition. And so I think, again, I'm not arguing that this is how we should read it. I think this is the best descriptive understanding of Kennedy's argument, that it's really about the right to love. Okay, then let me turn to the third part, the third way in which the opinion is about love, the equal protection analysis in Obergefell. He argued that the denying same-sex couples the right to marry also violated equal protection, because that denial, that exclusion, demeans same-sex couples and LGBT. And when he talks about the law being demeaning, that exclusion being demeaning, here's a sentence that kind of gets to it, and it kind of gets to ultimately to the concept of unconditional love. So he says, so he's talking about Lawrence versus Texas, the case in which Kennedy wrote the opinion saying same-sex sodomy laws, criminalizing same-sex intimate relations, violates substantive due process and also equal protection. Well, mostly substantive due process with some equal protection elements. And he said that case transformed outlaws into outcasts. But what Obergefell does is that, well, he says, quote unquote, outlaw to outcast may be a step forward. So there was a step forward in Lawrence, but it does not achieve the full promise of liberty and equality. So the case is about really saying we're not going to treat groups like the LGBT as outcasts. And the restriction on same-sex marriage is the means LGBT, the means same-sex couples, and essentially treats them as outcasts. Okay, what does it have to do with unconditional love? Here's a definition of demean: to lower in dignity, honor, standing. It's about debasing another, degrading, humiliating, dehumanizing, disrespecting, shaming others. I want to suggest demeaning, right? The word demean, to demean, is the exact opposite of love, right? To be loving to someone. It's actually being unloving to people. And it's virtually the opposite of all the words that go into the definition of love as metta, right? The notion of the Buddhist term for unconditional love. And so to demean, the way I think it's connected to love is that it's not loving kindness to LGBT or to a group, it's unloving unkindness. And for Kennedy, that's a law that's demeaning, unloving to a group. violates equal protection. You cannot, you violate the principle of equal protection by demeaning, being unloving, unkind to a particular group. And that ultimately implicates the notion of unconditional love. And so there's underlying that equal protection analysis is this notion that there's a duty of the state to kind of, at least if it maybe not provide unconditional love, but don't deny, right? If they're going to provide one group some kind of love, don't deny it to others through demeaning them, treating them with unkindness. Okay, so that's my argument as a descriptive matter. I want to talk about some of the, and I think I'm going to go for 5 minutes or so, and then take any questions you might have or comments. Some of the broader implications of my argument. If there's something to what I'm saying, that as a descriptive matter, Kennedy is in fact infusing his 14th Amendment analysis, due process, and protection with the principle and ethos of love. The question is whether or not we should think about equal protection, 14th Amendment due process in that way. And that's an argument I need to develop, that there's a normative argument for thinking about the 14th Amendment through love, that love, specifically unconditional love, may be and should be considered one of the animating principles, fundamental principles underlying the 14th Amendment. But I think that's an argument for another day once I've developed this argument further. Another implication about my argument that Obergefell is about love, once you think about the 14th Amendment that way, you can think about other equal protection or due process decisions as being about love. So I'll just mention one example, Brown versus Board of Education. That the language in that decision makes sense as an expression, the court expressing unconditional love for African-American students who were segregated, and he's being treated as inferior through that segregation and separation. And here's that key sentence, the famous sentence in that case, which I think is an expression of empathy, compassion, rooted in unconditional love. He says, to separate African-American children from others of similar age and qualification solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. The hearts and mind language really gets to issues like compassion and empathy, and that segregation denies that to African-American children, in fact, treats them as inferior, demeans them, and therefore violates equal protection. So we can look at Brown as maybe the first iteration of Obergefell in terms of connection between the 14th Amendment and love. And then in terms of just broader implications of thinking about the law, the Constitution in terms of love, is its impact for transforming public discourse more broadly about liberty and equality. So I presented this paper at the Central States Conference last fall, and someone made, I forget her name, but she made it, I thought was a great point, that by focusing in Obergefell on really about love, that the whole notion of love is love, right, underlying that decision, Kennedy's opinion, it's a way of promoting dialogue and exchange between LGBT and those who oppose same-sex marriage, especially on religious ground, because both sides speak the same language of love. And instead of having an opinion focus on, discriminatory motive, animus, she was saying, at least, even though the both sides may not ultimately agree, if they're speaking, at least they're speaking the same language, and that provides some measure of possibility for maybe compromise, so meaningful exchange, etc. So that is what I mean by that love can actually be transformative of public discourse and promote actually the kind of oneness, solidarity with all of humanity through the discourse of love. Okay, and then what? Just two more points. One is, well, is there a sort of like an originalist argument for my argument about unconditional love in the 14th Amendment? And what's the constitutional basis for arguing unconditional love as being a principle under the 14th Amendment? Obviously I'm not making an originalist argument, and I think I would call what I'm arguing an aspirational constitutionalism, where this kind of constitutionalism is about interpreting the Constitution in the best light possible, uncovering and activating its highest ideals and highest form, and to think about the Constitution that way. And that I argue in this way, you can argue in terms of the highest principles, highest aspirations, especially of the 14th Amendment. It could be, you can think about it as unconditional love. Okay, let me pull up the PowerPoint. And this also, I want to end with the PowerPoint slide about the way discourse about equal protection, equality, and liberty has been transformed by Obergefell. And the slogan, love is love. Whoever came up with love is love, absolute genius. It totally transformed the discourse about LGBT rights. And so, okay, it's frozen. Not sure what's, let me try. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here's how love has helped, and Obergefell has helped transform the way, at least in public discourse, we think about equality and love, but it actually is about connecting love with equality. Here's Obama's statement about love and equality. After Obergefell, all people should be treated equally regardless of who they are or who they love, connecting equality with love. Evan Wolfson, a lawyer who argues for LGBT rights, says marriage is a language of love, equality, and inclusion. And then here are some memes and slogans I found online that connects these popular slogans, memes, t-shirts, slogan, whatever, connecting love and equality and liberty. I love this one. All love is equal. And the balance, the way, the balance of justice, and saying love is about equality, and love is about providing justice for all. Love is equality, equating love and equality as the same thing, which is kind of my argument. And then here's connecting love to hope, equality, inclusion, and kindness. Notions of inclusion and diversity is connected to love. Similarly, love, liberty, equality, compassion, acceptance, and empathy, connecting love to equality, compassion, empathy to equality. And I love this one. I think this is probably from Texas. Don't mess with equality, gay or straight, love is love. And and in terms of transforming public discourse, with love transforming public discourse and equality and love, I want to end with this Martin Luther King quote about unconditional love. He says, "Unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality." And I add the word transforming. Unconditional love will and can have the final word in transforming reality. And I think that's the potential of putting love into law, incorporating love into law, incorporating love into public discourse. It actually can transform reality in a positive, in a good way. Okay, and so let me end there. Stop share. Okay. So yeah, that's all I have. And so if you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear them. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, so pretty interesting. And this feels to me a lot like your last paper on Loving and Brown. It's like rethinking opinions that people think of as sort of sui generis and perhaps not very well theorized or something. So here's a devil's advocate question, though. I wonder if, your interest in connecting, this love value or Obergefell, however it's explained, to equality, is a little dangerous because, I think that a majority of the court, more so now than ever, views equality as formal equality only. And that poses all these kinds of problems. As long as you have, the same formal opportunities as everyone else, nothing matters. So I don't exactly know how my next point connects to that, but I think it does. So my basic question for you is it dangerous to connect equality to, LGBT rights in that way? And just more generally, I wondered, as I was like, I'm not exactly sure I understood what follows from, sticking the word love in there. Like, it makes sense to me if I say love. I mean, that's fine, but I think it does actually still matter what Anthony Kennedy meant, whether love makes sense to you or not. And in keeping with that problem of formal equality, I wonder if Kennedy would say, yeah, I really didn't mean love. I meant marriage. Like, I meant civil sanction of marriage, like all other formally equal institutional steps, which we require as a matter of equal protection, even if people aren't really equal. So for those reasons, I wonder if, this might be a bit of a misreading of at least Kennedy's personal view. And is it possible that his personal view is actually a little more dangerous than you want to admit?
So let me take the second point. Yeah, you can disagree that as a descriptive matter, that's not the correct reading, or I'm reading too much into it. I don't think I am. And if you read the opinion, it's not just saying, oh, you can easily include the word love. It's the word love more than marriage, especially with the substantive due process analysis about the right to autonomy, makes much more sense and brings some substance to marriage beyond just, oh, you get a license, you get married, and you get state recognition. The substantive your argument makes sense from the equal protection argument about, oh, you got the state recognizing and giving approval to different sex marriage, but not to same sex marriage. That is about equality and the way the state is treating, and it's really about the institution and arguably nothing to do with love, right? It's just about the institution of marriage and all the legal rights and responsibilities associated with marriage. And there is that aspect to the opinion. But the personal autonomy analysis is not connected to the institution. He makes no real connection. His strongest argument is personal autonomy is really, I think it's the love part that connects marriage to personal autonomy, self-definition. So I think, particularly, maybe I should clarify with the two different kinds of analysis, but I think I am making a fairly accurate. I don't think I'm reading too much into it. I think it's there. And his talk about language, about the transcendent meaning of marriage, that notion of transcendent is not just about that. That's a language that theorists about love, poets about love invoke, and it's not just about marriage. And so the other language that he invokes is more, I argue, more than about marriage. It's really about love, marriage being a subset of love. And then to your first point, I actually argue with, let's say, formal equality and affirmative action. The concept of unconditional love would justify affirmative action, because to the extent that white applicants to schools, there's a higher standard for white applicants. It's not out of unloving. It's not unloving. It's not out of lack of unconditional. It's not demeaning in denying that. No, it's really saying we want to be inclusive of underrepresented groups. So as a matter of affirmative action, because that's devoid, right? The burdens imposed on whites, devoid of being unloving, demeaning. It's not about unkindness. Then it's fine. It doesn't violate equal protection. So that's my argument to the formal equality argument.
That's good. Thank you.
All right, Brian.
Thanks, Reggie. Definitely thought-provoking and creative as usual. As I've said before, I'm a constitutional skeptic, and so I always think about these things as what's the downside risk, right? So if we think of a constitution as designed to check democratic excess, right? And that's why we give authority to 9 people in our country to say to the rest of us, sorry, you can't do that, or you have to do this. So then you think about a concept like love, right? So the practical payoff here is, now if we embed love, then we're going to get sometimes, and perhaps in many cases, well, at a minimum, you need 5 people's understanding of love.
Right.
And so I worry a lot about that, right? Especially on the current court. Do I really want our Constitution to be able to tell all of us, hey, this is what love means, and this means you can't, as a democratic society, do these things because our vision of love prevents you from doing that. That's sort of like, the kind of raw power analysis of this, but I think you have to think those ways, because we've seen, first of all, we've seen this, our courts do it, but especially across the world, authoritarian governments are really, really good at exploiting constitutions, and especially exploiting aspects of constitutions that give power So, I mean, my own sense of it is this is not as creative as it is. I don't think there's a role for constitutions to embed this kind of sort of broad moral conception, and then because what it means is you're saying to democracy, you got to follow this conception of love. And although there might be, you've described the many wonderful things that could flow from that, you got to consider the opposite, right? Because that's the hard political reality is we're not always going to have, a Martin Luther King or an enlightened set of Buddhas on the high court, right? We're gonna have a group of fallible people who got there because they had good political connections, and that's just how it plays out. And then on a more positive note, there's a whole literature on dignity. There's a lot of constitutions throughout the world have dignity as an explicit right, and it's equally problematic from my view because dignity.
For the same reason you're saying, right? Yeah.
But there's a lot of really good work theorizing kind of what that means and how it ought to play out. I'm familiar lightly with it in the social and economic rights context because it is an affirmative value. But anyways, you might want to look there. But those are my thoughts. But thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right in terms of I got to think more about this in terms of limitation and abuse of power. Can this concept of unconditional love do that? And I have to think that through. Yeah, absolutely. I think but if we say let's incorporate unconditional love, we're actually rethinking it's a whole paradigm shift of democracy. Yeah.
I guess what I'm thinking about is, you mentioned Christian conservatives. Well, Christian conservatives have there's a fairly elaborated understanding of love, and it's connected to family, and it's connected to family roles, and it's deeply misogynistic from my perspective in the sense that a loving mother and wife is subordinate because of that love, and it's grounded in a religious understanding of God the Father. So that's what you play that out and think about, well, if we're going to create a vehicle to introduce those kinds of moral conceptions, you've got to recognize that it could very well be the vehicle to introduce ones that aren't consistent with meta, but are consistent with something else.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. I need to take that in terms of normative argument. I have to consider that definitely. Doron?
Yeah, thanks, Reggie. Great piece. I really appreciate it, as I told you in the previous drafts. In particular, I like the idea of love speech versus hate speech when it comes to LGBTQ. I think the gay marriage discourse has been so infused with hate speech that it would be very nice to inject some love into all of that. I want to make maybe one or two small comments. One is I totally understand both Chris and Brian's concern about practical constitutional law, that you can go to court with the right to the pursuit of happiness, and how can you go to court with the right to pursue love, basically. And I'm comfortable with the fact that sometimes it's our role as academia just to infuse the conversation with philosophical ideas, and that's definitely one of them. In that context, Mark asked in the comments if you looked into the Socratic definition of love, and I wanted to suggest to look at Isaiah Berlin, two views on liberty, the positive and the negative liberty, because I think in this particular context, the right to marry maybe serve as a very useful example for Isaiah Berlin's thoughts on that. And finally, I just wanted to say, you mentioned the outlaws, and William Esprit just wrote a book actually in 2020 called Marriage Equality from Outlaws to In-Laws, which you would love to look at. And in his 2021 recent Michigan Law Review piece, he writes, literally in the introduction, in less than 20 years, these LGBTQ minorities have moved from being outlaws and psychopaths to in-laws with jobs. So yeah, I think that this definitely culminates in the right to marry, and congrats on another great piece, Reggie.
All right, thanks. By Isaiah Berlin site, that's great. That's absolutely right. Love is connected to positive liberty more so than negative liberty. Okay, so yeah, thank you. Matt?
Hi, Reggie. A really interesting, thought-provoking piece. I was wondering whether or how you would incorporate Lawrence, if at all, into this discussion, because it seems that that kind of started it all with Obergefell to lead up to, and to the extent that love is replaced with marriage, I mean, we don't really need that formal recognition. And one of the things, Duran just brought up Bill Eskridge, one of the things he kept saying when Lawrence was out was it's all about relationship, right? I mean, that's sort of what undergirded Lawrence, was the relationship. I was wondering how your conception of love and that being replacing love with marriage, how that might spill over into other things, like, for instance, polyamorous relationships, whether there would be a stronger argument, due process clause for multiple spouses, because if it's all about love and not necessarily, I guess maybe the equal protection piece would cabin that a bit, but how that would play out with respect to those types of relationships. And then the other thing was when you were talking about love and the I thou. Yeah. And then I thought about sort of the traditional concept of marriage. It was more, I think, would you contrast it with the I-id,
right?
Yeah, sort of with coverture and some of those where the woman's rights were just subsumed, and she had none, and how does that advance the concept of love in the sort of I thou sense? Maybe it just did.
It did not. No, those were I-id relationships. Yeah.
Right. And I'm wondering whether Obergefell could be seen as an evolution in our understanding of what love is.
Right.
Because if you look at sort of those older forms of marriage, it just didn't give that sort of I thou feel or
yeah, no, that's a great point. And yes, Kennedy talks about the evolution of marriage. And I think you're absolutely right. It moves from the I, and he recognized there were unequal elements to marriage, and it's been evolving, and it evolved to a more egalitarian notion of marriage, and then including same-sex marriage. That evolution is from I to I thou. Yeah, I think that's right. And Lawrence, yes, and that kind of answers Chris's point. Lawrence was not about marriage, right? And Kennedy uses the same kind of, he used the word transcendent, talked about relationship in Lawrence, and Lawrence, he cites Lawrence in Obergefell. And not just to say it's moving from outcast to moving from outlaw to outcast, he's actually cites it as the basis for his argument. It becomes the basis for his argument for right to marry, and argued the right to love. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Abby.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, I'm walking through campus, so I don't know how good my connection is, but interesting paper. I know nobody ever makes friends by suggesting that people read Hegel, but but there is this great piece of Hegel where that is relevant to what you're talking about, I think, and could give you some normative purchase, which is that he says that the sort of core tension or core dialectic that needs to be played out in any human society is the tension between the individual wanting to be an individual and the antithesis of the individual being a member of a community that largely shapes his or her individual preferences. And then he argues that the ideal synthesis that sort of forms the foundation of all community is that of romantic love between two married people. And so he says that in that loving relationship, the individual rationally accepts limitations on his or her individuality for the sake of kind of maintaining the romantic relationship. So like you could get quite a bit of normative purchase, I think, out of saying, well, we have this kind of long.
Oh, I think you cut out. Oh, Abby, you still there? I think cut out. Well, I think that's a great citation, and I think it actually is consistent with the Rilke poem I cited, right? That it's about two autonomous beings creating something greater and achieving something greater while still being autonomous, which I think embodies the I-thou relationship, and maybe does kind of as a way to deal with that tension between individuality and one's community. So yeah, no, I will look at Hegel.
Can you hear me again? Or
yeah, now, yeah.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I was just gonna add that I think you can tie that pretty clearly into this like constitutional puzzle, longstanding constitutional puzzle of the due process clause as an individual right versus the equal protection clause as a group right or community right, and hold up Obergefell and the connection to love as a like really important bridge between two sort of disparate aspects of the 14th Amendment, and say like actually there's not nearly as much tension between individual rights and community rights as might first meet the eye. Wow. And here's an example of where like the Obergefell analysis that often gets criticized for not having grounded the right in either or, right? It sort of just does both and all the way through. You can say, well, that actually makes sense because the marital relationship is the bridge between the individual and the community.
That's yeah, no, it's really helpful. And Kennedy got bashed by the Chief Justice for saying your protection analysis makes no sense because you're saying it's all mixed up. I can't make sense of it, and you're helping to make sense of it through that Hegelian relationship and and the way to mediate the individual and the communal. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this reflects what somebody was saying earlier a little bit, but you know, what you're saying I find very appealing, and it makes a lot of sense to me as a description of same-sex, you know, relationships and marriages. I guess, you know, the conservative complaint, which I don't find has traction with respect to those relationships at least, but you know, this idea of just love as defined by the individual is, as other people have pointed out, like very capacious, right? And people could take it in all kinds of directions, including some directions that you might not like, or I might not like, or other people might not like. So I think, you know, the left has, you know, been kind of winning this battle, but the conservative challenge is there any limit on this? And is your view, the left, that there just is no limit? And so anything that anybody can define as for themselves what love means, unconditional love, then they have a right for the state to recognize that kind of a relationship. You know, Abby just talked about, apparently Hegel talks about this as a relationship between two people, but of course some people say no, it's not just two people, it could be, you know, more than two people, or it could be whatever. So is there any role for the state to play in defining the limits of this, or is that just kind of illegitimate? And if it's illegitimate, then where does that lead us?
Yeah, I think I have to ground whatever conception of love I'm arguing for somehow there's some constitutional basis for it, and that is a way of kind of defining the scope of state power. So, you know, I argue that any love that embodies I-it relationship is contrary to the kind of love embodied in the 14th Amendment, because what did the 14th Amendment deal with? Slavery and Jim Crow and Black codes, which are all about I-it relationships. And so you cannot protect I-it relationships via the 14th Amendment, because it was meant to eradicate those kinds of relationships on the basis of race. Brown, like I mentioned with Brown versus Board of Education. And to your point, I think any principle or concept is malleable enough you can use to argue one side or the other. That's a CLS argument, right? It's all, you know, indeterminate. And I think that's true of any, especially, you know, concepts of dignity that the court does rely on. Also mushy, right? What in the world does dignity mean? Equal concern and respect. What does that mean? So I think love, the thing about love that's different from those principles is not just that it's multidimensional. There's a kind of an emotional component to it. And that's another comment someone made about my argument, that when you talk about love, it's not just these abstract principles. There's some emotional component to it that is a kind of a different conception of what law is about, that maybe have normative appeal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, I was thinking about that when you were talking as well, is, you know, there are some challenges, and traditionally the law is, at least to some degree, pretty uncomfortable with giving legal status based on kind of emotional considerations, right? And so, for example, even if we think of hate crimes legislation, the word hate and emotion is right there in the statute. But if you read hate crimes statutes, they tend to actually remove the hate. It's not an element, right, that you hate someone. It's an element that you selected them based on a prohibited criteria. But an actual hatred or animus is not, you know, the kind of, because I think the law is uncomfortable kind of trying to track its judgments onto emotion. So I don't know. I mean, I wonder if there are other areas where the law kind of, connects more directly with emotion. And I'll actually suggest one, which is that in the criminal law, the provocation doctrine, which is instead of being guilty of manslaughter, you can be guilty of only voluntary, or instead of being guilty of murder, you can be guilty only of voluntary manslaughter. If you were provoked and you were sufficiently or reasonably provoked. And really what that seems to be is making a judgment about whether your extreme anger, your emotion, was kind of normatively justified. So it's kind of applying a normative evaluation of the person's emotional response. And I think that is there in the law, but it feels like there are a lot of places where the law is very reluctant to kind of track directly onto human emotion.
Right. Absolutely. And that's something I got to explore. And what does it mean to have a law where you incorporate emotion that's more embodied? What are the implications? I think there's some good ones, but I have to think that through. Yeah, absolutely. And if the law actually incorporates kind of the negative emotions, right, what you're talking about, why can't it incorporate and be embodied with positive emotions? So thanks. Daron.
No, I'm out. I'm sorry. I should.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Does anyone have any other thoughts or questions, or I can talk a little bit more about some points? Well, let me talk a little bit more about some points, which is, and this goes to, I think, all the running theme, right? That we think of the Constitution as limit or restriction on power. And the original Constitution, the famous quote from James Madison's Federalist paper, the reason why we need government to constrain people's liberty is because men are not angels. If men were angels, we don't need government. And that is based on fundamentally a kind of notion of human nature. That kind of understanding about what the Constitution was, at least at the original founding, was about. And so I think, though, the question I think about, and I don't know the answer to this, to what extent does the Constitution, based on that notion of human nature, reinforce that nature, right? Makes it actually, solidifies it, maybe even makes it worse. So just throwing that out there, if that's the case, maybe if we incorporate some more positive elements, our understanding of humanity, human nature, that could have the opposite effect, right? Of pushing us to our higher selves, our better selves. And that's what I mean by aspirational, that can we think about more of a constitution that's aspirationally based, not fear-based, about checking governmental power, abuse of power, which should be there, but maybe is there a room for a more positive principle based where there's emotion involved that can limit power, restrict power, but also promote a more affirmative duty of government to benefit, help people pursue happiness, right? That the notion of pursuit of happiness is there, right? That's emotional, that has emotional elements, and it's part of the original founding. And the 14th Amendment is the second founding. So to what extent, I've been arguing that it's the 14th Amendment that could embody unconditional love. If so, it's arguably embodying a different notion of human nature, and that we have to kind of synthesize the original foundings understanding of human nature and the second foundings understanding of human nature, and maybe come to a synthesis, maybe using the Hegelian synthesis that Abby talked about, to mediate the concerns about that, we need to check governmental power, and love can't do that. I'm suggesting maybe love could, from a more positive angle and less of a negative angle on human nature. So I'll just throw that out there.
Excellent. Any other final questions or comments? Looks like we're about at 1 o'clock. So,
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for your great participation.
Thanks.
Reggie, thanks for your presentation. Really, really fascinating project, and best of luck.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming. Have a good spring break if I don't see you. All right. Bye.
Bye, guys.